a constitution so fragile that courtiers whispered he would never survive to adulthood. Yet survive he did, driven by an iron will that would compensate for what his body lacked in strength. The political landscape of 17th century Europe was a treacherous maze of shifting alliances and religious conflicts. Protestant England lived in constant fear of Catholic dominance, while Louis XIV's France cast a shadow over the entire continent. William's ascension to power came not through birthright alone, but through the desperate invitation of English nobles who saw him as their salvation from the Catholic tyranny of James II. The glorious revolution of 1688 had brought him to the English throne, but at a cost that would echo through the remaining years of his life. The crossing to England in 1688 had been a gamble that could have ended in disaster. With a fleet of 500 ships and 15,000 men, William had sailed through November storms that claimed vessels and lives. The Protestant wind, as his supporters called it, carried him to Torbay, but the physical toll of the journey was immense. Already suffering from chronic respiratory ailments, the harsh sea air and stress of the invasion weakened him further, planting the seeds of the health crisis that would eventually consume him. His marriage to Mary, James II's daughter, had been both a political masterstroke and a personal tragedy. While their union secured his claim to the throne and provided legitimacy to the revolution, it was a relationship marked by infidelity, emotional distance, and unspoken resentments. Mary's death from smallpox in 1694 had shattered what little emotional stability William possessed. Witnesses described how the stoic king collapsed into tears at her bedside, his carefully constructed composure crumbling as he realized he would face the remainder of his reign alone. The grief that followed Mary's death was not merely emotional, but physical in its manifestation. William's already fragile health deteriorated rapidly, his asthma worsening to the point where courtiers feared he might suffocate during particularly severe attacks. Palace physicians noted alarming changes in his appearance. His skin took on a grayish pallor, his eyes became sunken and bloodshot, and his hands developed a persistent tremor that made even the simple act of signing documents a struggle. The wars against France had defined William's reign, but they had also drained him of whatever vitality remained. The siege of Namur, though ultimately successful, had required him to spend months in damp, disease-ridden military camps. The constant stress of command, combined with exposure to battlefield conditions, accelerated his physical decline. Veterans who served under him noted how the king would often double over in coughing fits so severe that blood would stain his handkerchief, yet he refused to abandon his duties or show weakness before his enemies. As the new century dawned, William's body had become a battlefield where multiple ailments fought for dominance. His asthma, never fully controlled, now rendered him breathless after even minor exertion. Gout, the disease of kings, had twisted his joints into painful knots that made walking an agony. His digestive system, weakened by years of military rations and stress, could barely process food, leaving him gaunt and malnourished despite the palace's abundant kitchens. The political pressures of his reign had taken their own toll on his deteriorating constitution. Parliament's increasing demands for oversight and limitation of royal power created constant tension that manifested in sleepless nights and anxiety-induced stomach ailments. Foreign ambassadors reported that the king appeared to age months in the span of weeks, his face becoming increasingly haggard as he struggled to balance the demands of governance with his failing health. Dr. Thomas Gibson, the royal physician, maintained detailed records of William's condition during these final years. His notes paint a disturbing picture of a man whose body was systematically shutting down. Regular bloodletting, the preferred medical treatment of the time, only served to weaken him further. The king's urine, Gibson noted, had become dark and cloudy, indicating severe kidney dysfunction. His sleep was plagued by nightmares and breathing difficulties that left him exhausted each morning. The winter of 1701 brought with it a series of health crises that nearly killed William, months before his actual death. A severe respiratory infection confined him to bed for weeks, during which time he could barely speak above a whisper. Courtiers reported hearing him mumbling in Dutch during his fevered delirium, calling out for Mary and reliving battles from decades past. The infection left his lungs permanently scarred, making each breath a conscious effort that required all his remaining strength. Social events at court became increasingly rare as William's condition worsened. The king, who had once been known for his reserve, now avoided public appearances altogether, not out of shyness but out of necessity. His appearance had become so alarming that foreign diplomats wrote to their capitals describing a man who looked more like a corpse than a monarch. His clothes hung loosely on his emaciated frame, and his once sharp eyes had become clouded with pain and exhaustion. The psychological impact of his physical decline was perhaps even more devastating than the illness itself. William had built his entire identity around strength, determination, and the ability to overcome any obstacle through sheer force of will. Now faced with an enemy he could not defeat through military strategy or political maneuvering, he experienced a profound sense of helplessness that ate away at his spirit as surely as disease consumed his body. His relationship with food became a source of particular anguish. Once able to sustain himself on soldiers' rations during lengthy campaigns, William now found that even the finest delicacies prepared by the palace cooks caused him severe digestive distress. He would sit at the royal table, picking at his meal, while courtiers pretended not to notice the way his hands shook or how he would suddenly double over in pain. The servants who attended William during this period left behind accounts that reveal the full extent of his suffering. They described nights when the king's breathing became so labored that they feared he might not survive until dawn. His bedchambers reeked of medicinal poultices and the sharp smell of illness. The royal bed, once a symbol of power and prestige, had become little more than a sickbed where William fought his nightly battles against pain and suffocation. February 1702 brought with it the event that would seal William's fate. On a crisp winter morning, seeking respite from the stifling atmosphere of Kensington Palace, the king decided to ride his favorite horse, Sorrel, through the grounds of Hampton Court. The horse, startled by a molehill, stumbled and threw William to the frozen ground. The fall itself might not have been fatal for a younger, healthier man, but for William's brittle bones and weakened constitution, it was a catastrophe from which there would be no recovery. The broken collarbone that resulted from the fall was initially dismissed by physicians as a minor injury. However, William's compromised immune system and poor circulation meant that what should have been a straightforward healing process became complicated by infection and inflammation. The bone refused to set properly, leaving him in constant agony and unable to move his right arm without excruciating pain. This physical limitation was particularly cruel for a man who had always maintained his dignity through perfect posture and controlled movements. The weeks following the accident were marked by a steady decline that all who witnessed it recognized as irreversible. William's fever, which had initially been attributed to the shock of the fall, refused to break, despite the best efforts of his medical team. His appetite disappeared entirely, and he began losing weight at an alarming rate. Courtiers noted that his clothes, already loose from previous weight loss, now hung on him like burial shrouds. The king's mental state during these final weeks was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of his decline. Previously sharp and decisive, William now struggled with confusion and memory lapses that left him uncertain about basic facts of his own life. He would sometimes call for Mary, seemingly forgetting that she had died 8 years earlier, or give orders for military campaigns that had ended decades before. These moments of confusion were particularly distressing to his attendants, who watched a great mind crumble along with the body that housed it. As February turned to March, it became clear to everyone in the palace that William was dying. Foreign ambassadors began making discreet inquiries about succession protocols, while Parliament prepared for the transition to Anne, Mary's sister. The king himself seemed to understand what was happening, and on his better days he would make efforts to put his affairs in order. His signature, once bold and confident, became a shaky scrawl that barely resembled his former handwriting. Dr. Gibson's final medical reports describe a man whose body had begun the process of shutting down. William's kidneys were failing, evidenced by the complete cessation of urination and the buildup of toxins that gave his skin a yellowish tinge. His breathing, always labored, became increasingly shallow and irregular. The physician noted that the king's hands and feet had begun to turn cold and purple, clear signs that his circulation was failing. The last week of William's life was a prolonged agony that tested the limits of human endurance. Unable to keep down even small sips of water, he quickly became dehydrated, which only accelerated his body's breakdown. His lips cracked and bled, his tongue swelled, and his voice became little more than a hoarse whisper. Palace records show that he required constant attention from servants who had to regularly moisten his mouth and adjust his position to prevent bed sores. Religious comfort, which might have provided some solace to other dying monarchs, offered little relief to William. His relationship with faith had always been complicated, shaped more by political necessity than personal conviction. As death approached, he showed little interest in the prayers offered by court chaplains, instead spending his lucid moments dictating final instructions for government business that would outlive him. On the morning of March 8, 1702, William III drew his final breath in a small chamber at Kensington Palace. Dr. Gibson noted that the king's death was neither sudden nor peaceful, but rather the culmination of hours of gradually weakening respiration and increasing unconsciousness. His final moments were witnessed by a handful of courtiers and servants, who later described how his body seemed to simply give up the struggle it had been fighting for so many years. The immediate aftermath of William's death revealed the extent to which his physical decline had been hidden from the public. When news of the king's passing spread through London, many citizens expressed shock at how quickly he had deteriorated. Foreign observers noted that the English court had become skilled at concealing the true extent of their monarch's illness, maintaining the fiction of royal strength even as William lay dying. The autopsy performed on William's body provided a grim catalogue of the ailments that had plagued his final years. His lungs were found to be severely scarred and filled with fluid, explaining the breathing difficulties that had tormented him. His heart showed signs of significant enlargement and damage, likely the result of years of strain from his respiratory problems. Most tellingly, his kidneys were described as nearly completely destroyed, confirming that his body had been slowly poisoning itself for months. The funeral preparations for William III were marked by the same attention to dignity that had characterized his life, but those who had witnessed his final days could not forget the reality behind the royal pageantry. His emaciated body required careful preparation to present an acceptable appearance for the lying in state at Westminster Hall. The elaborate funeral clothes had to be extensively altered to fit his reduced frame, and cosmetics were necessary to restore some color to his pallid complexion. The burial of William III in Westminster Abbey on April 12, 1702, drew mourners from across Europe, but many who attended were struck by the contrast between the magnificent ceremony and the diminished man they were honoring. His tomb, shared with his beloved Mary, bears no indication of the prolonged suffering that marked his final years. The inscription speaks of his victories and achievements, but nothing of the personal battles he fought against his own failing body. The immediate political consequences of William's death were swift and significant. Anne's accession to the throne marked the end of the Orange dynasty in England and the beginning of a new chapter in British history. However, the broader implications of William's reign, particularly the establishment of parliamentary supremacy and Protestant succession, would shape the future of the British monarchy for centuries to come. Historical accounts written in the years following William's death often glossed over the grim details of his final period, preferring to focus on his military and political achievements. This sanitized version of history served the interests of his successors, who needed to maintain the mystique of royal power and divine right. The reality of a king dying slowly and painfully from mundane ailments did not fit the narrative of monarchical grandeur. Medical historians studying William's case have since identified his symptoms as consistent with several chronic conditions that were poorly understood in the 17th century. His respiratory problems likely stemmed from severe asthma, complicated by repeated respiratory infections. The kidney failure that ultimately killed him may have been the result of years of untreated high blood pressure, a condition that would not be properly understood for another 2 centuries. The psychological impact of William's prolonged illness on those who served him created a lasting impression on the English court. Servants and courtiers who had witnessed the king's suffering carried with them a profound understanding of human mortality that influenced their approach to serving subsequent monarchs. Many of their accounts, preserved in private letters and journals, provide unique insights into the reality of royal life, stripped of its ceremonial trappings. The molehill that caused William's fatal fall became the subject of considerable speculation and folklore in the years following his death. Jacobite sympathizers claimed it was divine intervention, while William's supporters dismissed such notions as superstition. Modern historians note the irony that a man who had survived numerous battles and assassination attempts should ultimately be brought down by such a seemingly minor accident, highlighting the fragility that had always characterized his physical existence. Foreign diplomats' reports from William's final months provide valuable contemporary perspectives on his decline. French ambassador reports to Louis XIV describe a man consumed by his own ambition and the weight of his crown, while Dutch representatives noted with sadness how their former stadtholder had become a shadow of the warrior prince who once led our armies to victory. These external observations confirmed the dramatic change in William's appearance and demeanor during his final year. The medical treatments that William received during his final illness reflect the limited understanding of disease and healing available in 1702. The constant bloodletting that weakened him further, the ineffective poultices and purgatives that provided no relief, and the complete inability of physicians to address his kidney failure all contributed to his suffering. Modern medical knowledge suggests that many of his symptoms could have been managed more effectively, potentially extending his life by several years. The emotional toll of William's death on those closest to him was profound and lasting. Lord Portland, his closest friend and confidant, never fully recovered from witnessing the king's prolonged agony. Other courtiers reported nightmares and lasting distress from the memory of William's final weeks. The trauma of watching a once powerful ruler reduced to such a pitiful state affected everyone who was present, creating a shared understanding of mortality that influenced court culture for years to come. The transformation of William III from the vigorous prince who crossed the English Channel in 1688 to the broken man who died at Kensington Palace in 1702 represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how power and prestige cannot shield anyone from human suffering. His final days serve as a stark reminder that beneath the crown and royal robes lay a man whose body was subject to the same frailties and limitations as any of his subjects. The legacy of William's suffering extends beyond the immediate impact of his death to influence our understanding of the human cost of political power. His willingness to endure years of pain while continuing to fulfill his royal duties provides insight into the dedication and sacrifice that effective leadership often requires. Yet it also raises questions about the wisdom of systems that demand such personal costs from those who serve in positions of ultimate responsibility. The secrets hidden within the palace walls during William's final months reveal a level of deception that bordered on state conspiracy. Lord Albemarle, William's trusted Dutch confidant, orchestrated an elaborate system of body doubles and carefully timed public appearances to maintain the illusion of royal health. On days when William was too weak to leave his chambers, actors wearing similar clothing would appear at palace windows, waving to crowds gathered outside. These theatrical performances became increasingly sophisticated as William's condition worsened, with the doubles studying his mannerisms and even practicing his distinctive walk. The financial implications of concealing the king's illness created a secondary crisis within the royal household. Enormous sums were spent on experimental treatments imported from across Europe, mercury compounds from German alchemists, exotic herbs from the Orient, and even powdered unicorn horn from dubious Italian merchants. The royal treasury records show expenditures that dwarf those of previous monarchs, as desperate courtiers pursued every possible cure, no matter how expensive or fantastical. Dr. Sloane, later founder of the British Museum, was secretly consulted and brought revolutionary new medicines from his extensive collection. The international espionage network that developed around William's illness transformed European diplomatic relations in ways that historians are only now beginning to understand. French spies, disguised as servants and tradesmen, infiltrated the palace to assess the true extent of the king's deterioration. Meanwhile, Dutch intelligence agents worked frantically to suppress information that might destabilize the Protestant alliance. Secret codes were developed to communicate William's daily condition to key allies without alerting enemy agents who monitored all official correspondence. The psychological manipulation employed by William's inner circle to maintain his will to live reveals disturbing insights into 18th century medical practice. Court physicians, recognizing that despair would hasten his death, created elaborate fantasies about his recovery and future military campaigns. They commissioned artists to create detailed battle plans for imaginary wars against France, knowing that William's strategic mind needed engagement to stave off complete mental collapse. These fictional campaigns became so detailed that some historians initially mistook them for actual military preparations. The role of supernatural beliefs and occult practices in William's final treatment reflects the era's complex relationship between science and superstition. Astrologers were secretly consulted to determine the most auspicious times for medical procedures, while court magicians attempted to transfer William's illness to condemned criminals through elaborate rituals. The Countess of Orkney, William's longtime mistress, reportedly hired Italian necromancers who claimed they could commune with Mary's spirit to learn healing secrets from beyond the grave. The development of the first primitive pain management techniques occurred in direct response to William's unbearable suffering. Dr. Thomas Sydenham, known as the English Hippocrates, was summoned to develop new methods of administering opium that could provide relief without rendering the king unconscious during important state functions. These experiments led to breakthrough discoveries in dosage control and delivery methods that would later revolutionize medical practice, but at the time served only to prolong William's agony by keeping him alert enough to fulfill his royal duties. The impact of William's illness on architectural and technological innovation within the palace created lasting changes to royal residences. Specialized rooms were constructed with advanced ventilation systems designed to help his breathing, while mechanical lifts were installed to prevent the king from having to climb stairs. The famous Whispering Gallery communication system was developed to allow William to issue orders without straining his damaged voice, creating acoustic chambers where his faintest words could be amplified and transmitted throughout the palace. The emergence of a black market in royal medical information created an underground economy that persisted long after William's death. Palace servants sold intimate details of the king's condition to foreign agents, newspaper publishers, and wealthy collectors of royal memorabilia. Blood-stained bedsheets, medicine bottles, and even hair clippings from the king's increasingly infrequent grooming sessions commanded enormous prices among morbid collectors across Europe. The religious crisis that developed around William's refusal to undergo last rites created a constitutional emergency that threatened the stability of the Protestant succession. Archbishop Tennyson struggled with the theological implications of a monarch who might die outside the Anglican faith, while Catholic agents spread rumors that William had secretly converted on his deathbed. The king's Dutch Reformed background complicated matters further, as competing Protestant factions claimed authority over his spiritual welfare. The development of early pharmaceutical chemistry accelerated dramatically due to efforts to save William's life. Apothecary shops throughout London worked around the clock to create new compounds based on the latest theories from continental physicians. The king's urine and blood were analyzed using primitive chemical tests that represented the cutting edge of medical science. These experiments, while failing to save William, established methodologies that would later prove crucial to the development of modern medicine. The international marriage negotiations that began during William's illness reveal the cold pragmatism of European royalty in the face of imminent death. Despite being childless and obviously dying, diplomatic channels buzzed with potential matches for the king, as various courts hoped to position themselves advantageously for the succession crisis. These bizarre courtships, conducted through intermediaries while William lay gasping in his sickbed, illuminate the transactional nature of royal relationships. The emergence of early newspaper journalism was directly influenced by the secrecy surrounding William's condition. Publishers developed networks of informants within the palace, creating the first systematic royal reporting that would later evolve into modern celebrity journalism. The tension between official palace statements and leaked information from servants created a new form of public discourse that challenged traditional notions of royal privacy. The development of specialized medical equipment for William's care led to innovations that would benefit future generations of patients. Custom breathing apparatus, adjustable beds with mechanical positioning systems, and even primitive cardiac monitoring devices were created by the era's most skilled craftsmen. These inventions, born from desperate attempts to ease a dying king's suffering, represented significant advances in medical technology. The psychological profiles of those who attended William during his final weeks reveal fascinating insights into human behavior under extreme stress. Lady Portland developed severe anxiety disorders from watching her husband's anguish over the king's condition. Dr. Gibson began drinking heavily and showing signs of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress. The shared trauma of witnessing such prolonged royal suffering created lasting bonds among the survivors that influenced court culture for decades. The intelligence operations conducted by various European powers to verify William's death reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. French agents developed elaborate schemes to confirm that the king had actually died rather than been secretly moved to recover in hiding. Dutch representatives employed forensic techniques that were revolutionary for the time, examining the corpse with scientific rigor to ensure no deception was involved in the succession process. The economic disruption caused by uncertainty about William's health created the first modern example of how royal illness could destabilize financial markets. Trading in government bonds fluctuated wildly based on rumors about the king's condition, while currency exchanges across Europe reacted to every leaked piece of medical information. This financial volatility demonstrated the increasing interconnection between royal health and economic stability. The preservation techniques employed for William's corpse represent early advances in embalming and body preparation that would influence funeral practices for centuries. Exotic chemicals imported at enormous expense from Egyptian and Persian sources were used to slow decomposition during the extended period between death and burial. These methods, while primitive by modern standards, represented the most advanced preservation techniques available in early 18th century Europe. The cultural impact of William's prolonged dying process influenced artistic and literary works throughout the following century. Poets wrote epic verses about the tragedy of a warrior king reduced to helplessness, while painters created allegorical